You think this wind is a joke? Gunnery Sergeant Miller barked, his voice cutting through the tense morning air, the flags on the range snapping sharply in the breeze, each one a testament to conditions that no computer could fully predict. Dean Peters, 82, stood a few yards back, denim jacket faded to gray, hands tucked into pockets, eyes calm and piercing beneath a cloud of white hair, scanning the 1,700-yard range like he was reading a map only he could see. The young Marines shifted uneasily, spotting scopes glinting under the sun, ballistics computers buzzing with calculations, each solution more contradictory than the last. "We've been at this all morning, Pops," Miller continued, arms crossed, pride and frustration warping his tone. "Your wind tricks won't help here. Tech has it covered." Dean didn't answer. He stepped closer to the firing line, slow, deliberate, the worn leather of his boots whispering against the gravel. He bent slightly, fingers brushing the gouge in the walnut stock of his M40, a scar from a day decades ago when rain turned a valley into a mirror of chaos, a place where one misread could have ended more than just pride. The memory stirred, a flash of triple canopy jungle, the scent of wet earth and cordite, the hum of distant rotors mixing with the roar of storms overhead. Lance Corporal Evans, observing from the edge, noticed the shift, a flicker in Dean's eyes, a weight in his stance that made the chatter of the young snipers seem trivial. Dean murmured softly, "It's not just one wind. It's three, all playing together." The phrase was calm, almost reverent, but it carried a gravity that froze Miller mid-gesture, his hand hovering over a tablet. Dean adjusted his stance, eyeing each flag, each subtle ripple of fabric, feeling the thermal currents with the precision of a man who had spent decades reading the invisible language of the battlefield. A light shimmer ran across the scope lens, but Dean's eyes saw more than metal and plastic. He saw patterns, angles, and a rhythm the others couldn't comprehend. Miller scoffed audibly, shifting his weight, trying to reassert control, but the undercurrent of tension had already shifted. Dean's hands moved with quiet confidence over the rifle, fingers nimble despite age, checking the alignment, testing the pressure on the bolt, listening to the whispers of the wind through the range markers. The Marines glanced at each other, uncertainty creeping into their posture, their calculations suddenly feeling shallow, incomplete. Dean drew a slow, steady breath, the world narrowing to the line of sight, the shifting flags, and the distant steel silhouette waiting for judgment. The sun glared off the metal target, but Dean's pale blue eyes were unshaken, absorbing the light without flinch. "Watch closely," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried yet commanded attention, and the Marines instinctively leaned in, curiosity mingling with unease. Every microsecond stretched, every twitch of the scope, every movement of the sniper team recorded in the silent theater of anticipation. Dean's posture was unyielding, unhurried, yet every motion was precise, rehearsed by years of instinct and memory. The air smelled faintly of gunpowder and sun-baked dirt, carrying the weight of decades of quiet preparation. The younger men whispered among themselves, not daring to challenge the calm authority emanating from the old veteran, feeling the silent pressure of experience pressing down upon their modern tools and confident calculations, realizing, in a moment that had not yet arrived, that this was not just skill, it was mastery tempered by time and survival, a presence that could bend the wind itself to its understanding. The range fell silent after those words, not because anyone believed them, but because nobody knew how to answer them. Dean Peters remained behind the rifle, his weathered hands resting lightly against the worn walnut stock, while the morning wind continued its restless dance across the valley. Gunnery Sergeant Miller let out a sharp breath and glanced toward the observation platform where several instructors had gathered. Their expressions reflected the same mixture of doubt and curiosity that now spread through the firing line. Nobody wanted to admit they were interested in what the old man might do next. Lance Corporal Evans lowered his spotting scope slightly. He had spent the last hour studying mirage patterns rolling above the sun-heated ground. The shimmering waves seemed alive today, twisting and bending in different directions depending on distance. The computers had struggled to interpret them. Dean seemed to understand them without effort. That unsettled him. Miller folded his arms tighter. "You keep talking about wind like it is some kind of living thing. Dean's eyes remained fixed downrange. It is. Several Marines exchanged glances. A few laughed nervously. Dean slowly lifted a finger toward a distant ridgeline nearly half a mile away. See those trees? Nobody answered immediately. Most had not even noticed them before. The tops are moving east. The grass below is moving west. And halfway between them, the air is rising. Miller frowned. He followed the direction Dean indicated. For the first time all morning, uncertainty crept across his face. The old veteran was describing conditions that none of their instruments displayed. Dean continued speaking in the same calm voice. Your computers are reading numbers. The bullet does not fly through numbers. It flies through the world. The statement lingered in the air. Evans felt something tighten in his chest. It sounded simple. Too simple. Yet somehow it carried more weight than all the technical briefings he had attended. Dean adjusted the rifle slightly and paused. His fingers brushed the deep gouge carved into the stock. For a brief moment, the bright range disappeared behind distant memories. He remembered another morning long ago. Heavy fog hanging over green hills. Damp air carrying the scent of rain. Young men depending on a single decision made in silence. Not because anyone ordered him to act. Because experience had taught him that hesitation could cost opportunities that never returned. The memory faded as quickly as it arrived. Back on the range, the flags continued snapping in uneven rhythms. Dean watched them patiently, listening, measuring, understanding. Meanwhile, Evans quietly stepped away from the line. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Something about this entire situation felt wrong. Not dangerous, just incomplete. Like everyone was missing an important piece of information. He moved behind a maintenance shed and scrolled through his contacts. There was one person on base who might know more. Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Hayes, a veteran instructor respected throughout the region. Evans pressed call. The line connected after 2 rings. Hayes. Evans swallowed. Gunny, sorry to bother you. There is an old civilian out here on range 7. Silence. And Evans looked back toward Dean. The old man stood motionless beside the rifle while dozens of younger Marines watched him. I think you might want to come see this yourself. On the other end of the line, Hayes did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different. Sharper. More alert. What is the old man's name? Evans glanced toward the firing line. Dean had not moved. The wind seemed to swirl around him like an old companion. Dean Peters, Evans answered. The silence that followed lasted almost 3 full seconds. Then Hayes spoke again. This time his voice carried none of its earlier calm. Do not let him leave. I am on my way. Dean Peters crouched slightly behind the rifle, adjusting his grip with deliberate care as if the weapon itself were a trusted companion rather than a tool. The morning sun reflected off the metal target, casting thin lines of light across the range that danced in the heat waves. He tilted the scope, aligning the crosshairs with subtle movements that betrayed decades of muscle memory. The younger Marines watched, some leaning forward in disbelief, others whispering tentative guesses about what the old man intended. Gunnery Sergeant Miller stepped closer, his brows furrowed, trying to mask a flicker of doubt that had appeared in his usually confident posture. Dean's eyes never wavered from the target. He exhaled slowly, letting the morning air fill his lungs, counting the rhythm of the flags flapping against the poles, reading the microcurrents of wind swirling across the open ground. Each breeze, each heat shimmer, each minor shift in temperature was a letter in a language only he could read. Lance Corporal Evans had his phone still in hand, line open to Gunnery Sergeant Hayes, but he was captivated, unable to tear his eyes from Dean's methodical motions. The rifle shifted slightly in Dean's hands, the worn stock creaking with the subtle pressure, and he placed a finger lightly on the bolt, checking tension, checking alignment. The world seemed to slow around him. For a moment, all calculations, all instruments, all theory that the Marines had relied upon felt inadequate, almost naive. Dean whispered under his breath, not for the others to hear. It will go where it needs. The phrase was quiet, almost like a mantra, but it carried certainty. Miller's jaw tightened. He cannot possibly. He stopped mid-thought as Dean exhaled and squeezed the trigger with a precision that defied expectation. Time seemed to compress as the bullet left the barrel, cutting through the air with a soft whistle that was almost musical against the background hum of the morning wind. The distant steel silhouette shifted slightly as it was struck, precise, perfect. Gasps and audible clicks of dropped equipment echoed across the line as every Marine registered what had happened. Dean Peters did not move, his posture calm, his expression unchanged, but the weight of accomplishment radiated in a quiet intensity that filled the space between the flags and the target. Lance Corporal Evans let his phone slip from his fingers, eyes wide, realizing that the old veteran's mastery had rendered their modern tools and calculations momentarily irrelevant. Miller's arms dropped, the defensive confidence drained, replaced by reluctant awe. The instructors on the observation platform leaned forward, murmuring among themselves, acknowledging what was impossible to deny. Dean gently replaced the rifle on its rest, his pale blue eyes sweeping the line of Marines, each glance measured, carrying a silent lesson about experience, patience, and the subtle interplay of observation and understanding. A soft breeze lifted dust along the range, and Dean adjusted his jacket, standing tall, shoulders squared, embodying a quiet authority that demanded respect without a word. Miller stepped back, the tension in his stance easing, replaced by a sense of humility he had not anticipated. Every young sniper watched in silence, the lesson clear without verbalization, understanding that technical skill alone could not match the quiet, measured expertise of a life lived mastering the nuances of the craft. The morning continued, the sun climbing higher, the flags still snapping in the wind, but the energy on the range had shifted irrevocably. Dean Peters remained in place, a figure of calm competence, proving that mastery is not measured by age or modern instruments, but by the depth of understanding and the patience to see the unseen. The range remained still, the soft hiss of the flags flapping in the wind the only sound that threaded through the tension. Dean Peters adjusted his stance, his pale blue eyes sweeping across the young Marines who now regarded him with a mixture of disbelief and newfound respect. Each one shifted uncomfortably, their high-tech instruments suddenly feeling insufficient against the subtle, intimate knowledge of wind, elevation, and trajectory that Dean carried effortlessly. Miller took a step closer, lowering his voice, attempting authority yet tempered by the undeniable display he had just witnessed. Dean tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the gesture without comment, his hands brushing the worn leather of the rifle stock as if drawing strength from its history. The sun climbed higher, casting heat waves across the targets, bending the light and creating illusions that had confused even the most sophisticated equipment. Dean's gaze tracked each movement, reading the range as a living environment, sensing each subtle change in the air. Evans kept his phone hidden now, Hayes' instructions lingering like a shadow over the line, reinforcing the quiet tension. Dean murmured to himself, words lost to the wind, counting microseconds, calculating angles instinctively, relying on decades of experience rather than numbers on a screen. The younger Marines watched his every motion, noticing how his fingers moved with measured precision, how his posture absorbed the environmental cues that they had overlooked. Miller whispered under his breath, almost to himself, acknowledging an understanding that had been previously denied, a respect forming silently in the heat of observation. Dean adjusted the scope slightly, the metal glinting, the crosshairs finding a perfect line that merged intuition and knowledge seamlessly. The range seemed to hold its breath, the moment stretching, fragile and intense, as if time had slowed to witness the culmination of quiet mastery. A soft gust rustled the grass, teasing the flags, yet Dean's focus remained unbroken, unyielding, patient. The target remained steadfast in the distance, a steel silhouette awaiting action. Dean exhaled slowly, aligning his final calculations in silence, the weight of decades of training and experience apparent in the way he measured every breath, every micro-movement of the wind. Evans glanced toward the observation platform, seeing Hayes approach briskly, his presence subtle yet authoritative, confirming that the situation had escalated beyond routine. Dean did not flinch, did not acknowledge the senior instructor overtly, yet the air around him vibrated with quiet command, the kind that only presence can convey. The younger Marines shifted, some lowering their eyes, some straightening their posture, all absorbing the lesson silently. Dean's hand moved lightly over the bolt, checking tension once more, his movements deliberate, a rhythm born of years in the field. The sun glared off the target, the heat waves shimmering across its surface, yet nothing escaped Dean's perception. He lifted his finger, adjusted, and exhaled again, the calmness radiating outward, infecting the line with a sense of inevitability. Every eye followed him. Every instrument seemed to pause, waiting. The moment was a balance of anticipation and revelation, of respect earned in silence, and understanding measured not in numbers, but in mastery of skill honed over decades. The wind shifted gently, carrying the sound of distant activity across the range, and Dean Peters remained still, embodying the quiet authority that had transformed doubt into reverence, disbelief into attentive observation, preparing for the next action that would define the morning. The low growl of an approaching utility vehicle drifted across the range long before anyone saw it. Heads turned toward the access road as Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Hayes stepped out before the vehicle had fully stopped. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s whose reputation carried weight far beyond the base. Conversations died instantly. Several Marines straightened their posture without being told. Hayes did not acknowledge them. His eyes locked onto the lone figure standing beside the rifle. For a brief moment, he simply stared. The confidence left his face, replaced by something far rarer. Recognition. Genuine recognition. Dean Peters remained focused on the range, seemingly unaware of the attention gathering around him. The wind brushed through his silver hair. The faded denim jacket hung loosely from his shoulders. To most people, he looked like an old civilian who had wandered onto a military installation. Hayes saw something entirely different. He saw a name that had survived decades inside training rooms, briefing halls, and stories exchanged quietly between instructors after hours. He walked forward slowly. Miller watched with growing confusion. He had expected Hayes to restore order, perhaps remove the old man from the firing line. Instead, the senior instructor approached with a caution usually reserved for highly respected visitors. "Mr. Peters." Hayes stopped several feet away. Dean finally turned his head. His pale blue eyes met Hayes. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Tom." Several Marines exchanged stunned looks. Nobody called Gunnery Sergeant Hayes by his first name. Nobody. Yet Hayes seemed completely unbothered. If anything, he appeared relieved. "I was not sure it was really you," Hayes said quietly. Dean glanced back toward the distant target. Still breathing. A few Marines chuckled nervously. Hayes did not. His expression carried too much respect. Miller stepped closer. "Gunny, who exactly is this guy?" Hayes remained silent for a moment. The question hung in the warm air. Then his eyes drifted toward the rifle, specifically toward the deep gouge carved into the walnut stock. Dean followed his gaze. His fingers brushed the scarred wood again. The simple movement triggered a memory buried beneath decades of silence. Suddenly, he was no longer standing beneath a clear American sky. He was 19 years old again. Morning fog rolled through distant hills. Moisture clung to every surface. The world smelled of wet earth and pine. Young soldiers waited anxiously for instructions that would never come from a manual. Nature did not care about manuals. Wind shifted unexpectedly through valleys. Visibility changed without warning. Equipment could calculate probabilities. Experience understood reality. A younger Dean lay quietly behind the same rifle, studying leaves moving high above the tree line. Others watched instruments. He watched the world itself. The memory lingered only seconds before fading. Back on the range, Dean released a slow breath. Hayes noticed the distant look in his eyes. He had seen that expression before in veterans carrying entire chapters of history behind a calm face. Miller folded his arms. His frustration was slowly transforming into curiosity. Around them, the younger Marines remained silent. Something important was happening. They could feel it, even if they did not yet understand it. Hayes looked toward the assembled shooters. "You boys think today is about marksmanship." He paused. The flag snapped sharply overhead. "It is not. Today is about learning the difference between information and wisdom." The statement settled heavily across the firing line. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And for the first time all morning, every Marine present understood that the lesson had only just begun. Dean Peters raised the M40 carefully, his fingers caressing the worn stock as if it were part of his own body. The younger Marines stepped back instinctively, sensing the shift in presence, the subtle command of authority emanating without words. Gunnery Sergeant Miller crossed his arms, tension still etched across his face, but curiosity had taken root, replacing the earlier arrogance. Dean's eyes scanned the distance again, noting the subtle vibrations of the flags, the way the heat waves bent light across the open expanse, and the minute undulations of the terrain that only decades of experience could translate into actionable information. He exhaled slowly, measuring the rhythm of the breeze, the direction, and the velocity in microintervals that no instrument could detect. Every detail, every nuance became a piece of an invisible puzzle that only he could see, an understanding born from years spent in environments where precision could mean the difference between failure and success. Lance Corporal Evans adjusted his position slightly, glancing toward the observation platform where Hayes stood, his presence steady, reassuring, and yet commanding a respect that did not require speech. Dean spoke softly, more to himself than anyone else. "Everything aligns." The words hung in the air, almost unnoticed, yet they carried a weight that pressed against the collective attention of the assembled Marines. Miller's gaze shifted involuntarily toward the target. He noticed subtle cues in the motion of the flags, the sway of tall grass, the shimmer of air above sun-heated surfaces, all elements that Dean had already calculated. The older man crouched slightly, aligning the crosshairs with a patience that seemed timeless. Each movement was deliberate, unhurried, yet loaded with the precision of experience that had been refined over decades. The younger Marines felt a quiet tension, the kind that makes one aware of knowledge they do not yet possess. The air carried the scent of warmed earth and faint ozone, amplified by the sunlight and shifting winds. Dean adjusted the scope minutely, exhaling once more, and the world seemed to slow around him, the breeze softening, the flags almost frozen mid-flap. Hayes took a step closer, eyes narrowing, recognizing the moment as one that would be recounted later not for the action itself, but for the lesson imparted through mastery and presence. Dean's finger moved to the trigger, his body steady, breathing controlled. The line of sight, the trajectory, the distance, and the subtle variations in air all integrated seamlessly into one fluid calculation. He squeezed the trigger gently. The bullet left the barrel with a whisper, moving through the air with perfect alignment, touching the steel target precisely where intended. A quiet gasp moved through the line of Marines. Instruments, calculations, and confidence collided with something older, deeper, and undeniable. Dean Peters lowered the rifle with a soft exhale, his posture relaxed, yet the authority lingered in the space around him. Every eye followed the result, understanding without instruction that mastery was not measured by youth, tools, or numbers, but by the combination of intuition, experience, and the patience to see and interpret what others could not. Miller's jaw loosened, the tension easing into a hesitant acknowledgement. Evans allowed himself a slow, deliberate exhale, realizing that the lesson they had just witnessed extended far beyond marksmanship. Hayes nodded slightly, imperceptibly, his presence reinforcing the unspoken respect that now filled the range. Dean's eyes swept across the young Marines, calm, unwavering, conveying without a word that the morning had already imparted its instruction, leaving each individual to absorb it in their own way. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the whispers of movement and time, and Dean Peters remained composed, a living testament to quiet skill, observation, and authority that spoke louder than any voice could. No one spoke for several long seconds. The distant steel target stood beneath the shimmering heat haze, silent proof of what every Marine on the firing line had just witnessed. Dean Peters rested the rifle gently against the shooting bench and stepped back. There was no trace of pride in his expression, no smile of victory, no attempt to draw attention. That was what unsettled them most. Men who wanted recognition usually chased it. Dean seemed completely indifferent to it. The wind continued moving across the valley, tugging at the flags as if reminding everyone that the lesson was not over. Gunnery Sergeant Hayes folded his arms and studied the younger Marines. Their faces had changed. The confidence that had filled the range earlier that morning had been replaced by something more valuable. Curiosity, respect, humility. Gunnery Sergeant Miller remained motionless near the bench. He stared at the rifle for a moment before finally looking toward Dean. "How long?" he asked quietly. Dean adjusted the cuff of his jacket. How long what? How long did it take you to learn all of that? Dean glanced toward the horizon. The answer did not come immediately. His eyes followed a hawk circling high above the ridgeline, riding invisible currents that no machine could fully measure. I am still learning. Several Marines exchanged surprised looks. Miller let out a short breath through his nose. He had expected a number. 20 years. 30 years. Maybe 40. Instead, he received an answer that somehow carried more weight than any statistic. Hayes nodded slowly. He understood exactly what Dean meant. True mastery was never finished. That was the difference. A younger Marine stepped forward hesitantly. Private First Class Carter. Barely 20 years old. Sir. Dean looked toward him. How did you know about the third wind? A faint smile appeared on Dean's weathered face. Because it fooled me once. The answer surprised them again. Carter frowned. When Dean's eyes drifted downward to the gouge in the rifle stock. The deep scar seemed darker beneath the afternoon sunlight. For a moment, the range disappeared. He remembered another valley, another mountain range, clouds hanging low across distant peaks. He remembered believing he had understood everything. Then nature reminded him otherwise. The lesson had stayed with him ever since. Not because someone taught it in a classroom, because experience had carved it into memory. The vision faded. Dean looked back toward the Marines. The world is always teaching. The problem is that most people stop listening. Silence followed. Even the wind seemed quieter. Hayes glanced toward the access road. A black government SUV had just entered the range perimeter. Several Marines immediately noticed it. Their posture straightened instinctively. The vehicle moved slowly across the gravel and came to a stop near the observation platform. The driver's door opened first. Then a senior officer stepped out wearing the insignia of a full colonel. Conversation stopped instantly. Hayes raised an eyebrow. He had not called anyone above his level. Neither had Evans. Yet somehow word had traveled. The colonel scanned the firing line. His eyes moved past dozens of Marines before settling directly on Dean Peters. The reaction was immediate. The colonel removed his sunglasses and stared for several seconds. Then he began walking toward the old veteran without hesitation. Miller noticed the change in his expression. It was not curiosity. It was not surprise. It was recognition. Deep recognition. The kind reserved for names that survive long after most people have forgotten them. Dean sighed softly as the senior officer approached. The gesture carried the weary familiarity of a man who had seen this happen before. Around them, every Marine on the range watched in complete silence, sensing that whatever happened next was about to reveal a story far bigger than a single shot across a firing range. The colonel's boots crunched softly against the gravel as he crossed the firing line. Every Marine watched him. Nobody understood why a senior officer would personally leave his vehicle to approach an elderly civilian standing beside an old rifle. Yet the closer the colonel came, the more unusual his expression became. It was not the face of a man evaluating a visitor. It was the face of someone confronting a piece of history he never expected to see in person. Dean Peters remained exactly where he was. The wind tugged gently at his jacket. His weathered hands rested comfortably on the rifle stock. Around him, dozens of Marines stood frozen in silence. The colonel stopped several feet away. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then the colonel extended his hand. Sir. The single word landed with surprising force. Not because of its volume, because of the respect behind it. Dean accepted the handshake. Colonel. The officer smiled faintly. I have been trying to meet you for 15 years. Confusion immediately spread through the younger Marines. Miller looked toward Hayes. Hayes simply nodded as if this development confirmed everything he already knew. The colonel glanced down at the rifle. His eyes settled on the deep gouge carved into the walnut stock. Recognition flashed instantly. You still carry it. Dean followed his gaze. It still works. A few Marines smiled quietly. The colonel laughed once. A short, genuine laugh. Then his expression grew serious again. My father talked about that rifle until the day he died. The words changed the atmosphere immediately. Hayes lowered his eyes. Even he seemed surprised. Dean's expression softened. Your father was a good man. The colonel nodded slowly. He said you taught him something during his first deployment that he never forgot. Dean tilted his head slightly. Only one thing. That earned another laugh. The tension eased momentarily, but curiosity continued building across the range. Every Marine wanted answers now. Miller finally stepped forward. Sir, who exactly is he? The question lingered in the warm afternoon air. The colonel looked around at the assembled Marines, then back toward Dean, almost as if asking permission. Dean sighed quietly. The reaction made Hayes smile. He had clearly seen it before. The colonel folded his arms. Most of you know the Advanced Long-Range Observation Program taught at Quantico. Several Marines nodded immediately. They had studied parts of it during training. The environmental reading methods, terrain interpretation, multi-layer wind assessment. More nods followed. The colonel pointed toward Dean. The foundation for that program came from field notes written by him over 40 years ago. Silence. Complete silence. Miller blinked. Evans stared openly. Several younger Marines exchanged stunned looks. The statement seemed impossible. The colonel continued. Every instructor who ever taught those concepts knows the material. Very few know where it originated. His eyes returned to Dean. You were looking at where it originated. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The flags continued snapping overhead. The distant target remained motionless beneath the afternoon sun. Yet everything felt different now. The old civilian standing beside the rifle was no longer an anonymous visitor. He was the source behind lessons they had studied without ever knowing the author. Dean shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. The colonel noticed immediately. So did Hayes. Neither man seemed surprised. Men who spent their lives mastering a craft rarely spent much time talking about themselves. The wind rolled across the valley again, carrying the scent of warm earth and cut grass. Dean looked toward the horizon. The same calm expression remained on his face. But the younger Marines no longer saw an old man standing on a firing range. For the first time, they were beginning to see the legend hidden behind the silence. For several moments, nobody said anything. The revelation settled over the firing range like a slow-moving cloud, impossible to ignore and impossible to rush. The younger Marines stood quietly beneath the afternoon sun, looking at Dean Peters with entirely different eyes. The old man shifted his weight slightly and glanced toward the distant hills beyond the range. He looked uncomfortable with the attention, not embarrassed, simply uninterested in being the center of it. The colonel recognized it immediately. Men who spent their lives building a reputation often talked about it. Men who earned one rarely did. Gunnery Sergeant Hayes smiled faintly and shook his head. You know, he said, looking toward the younger Marines. Every few years somebody asks where those techniques came from. Nobody ever believes the answer. A few Marines laughed quietly. Even Miller managed a small smile. The edge had disappeared from his posture hours ago. In its place stood something far stronger. Respect. Genuine respect. The colonel stepped beside Dean and looked across the firing line. Everything you boys practiced this morning came from books. He paused. Everything he showed you came from experience. The statement landed harder than any lecture. Dean adjusted the sling on the old rifle. His fingers paused briefly on the gouge carved into the walnut stock. The familiar scar caught the sunlight. For a moment his eyes lingered there, not on the damage itself, on the memory attached to it. A lifetime of lessons. A lifetime of mistakes corrected through patience and humility. Then he looked up again. Lance Corporal Evans finally gathered enough courage to ask the question everyone had been thinking. Sir, if you helped build all of this, why did nobody know who you were? Dean looked at him for several seconds. The wind stirred gently across the range. Somewhere above them a hawk continued circling effortlessly on invisible currents. Dean followed it with his eyes before answering. Because the lesson matters more than the teacher. Silence followed once again. Not the uncomfortable silence from earlier that morning. This one felt different. Thoughtful. Reflective. Several Marines lowered their eyes. Others stared toward the horizon. The answer carried more wisdom than any technical explanation could have. The colonel smiled. Hayes nodded. Miller looked down at his equipment, suddenly realizing how much he still had to learn. Dean slowly lifted the rifle and secured it over his shoulder. The movement signaled something important. He was leaving. No ceremony. No speech. No demand for recognition. Just a quiet departure. The Marines instinctively stepped aside, creating a path without being told. Dean began walking toward the parking area at the edge of the range. Gravel crunched softly beneath his boots. The afternoon breeze tugged at his faded jacket. Halfway there, he stopped and turned slightly. His eyes swept across the young Marines one final time. Learn the numbers, he said calmly. Then learn when they are wrong. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Dean gave a small nod and continued walking. The silence remained long after he disappeared beyond the parked vehicles. Even after the colonel returned to his SUV. Even after Hayes dismissed the training session. The range felt different. The flags still snapped in the wind. The distant steel targets still stood beneath the heat haze. Yet every Marine present understood that they had witnessed something far more valuable than a perfect shot. They had witnessed the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Years later, many of them would forget the weather from that day. They would forget the exact distance. They would forget the equipment they carried. But they would remember the old man with the worn rifle who taught them that mastery was not loud, and that true expertise never needed to announce itself. Some salutes last a lifetime.